Hello, Rocky Ridge students. This is Mr. Johnson, and we are on Chapter 9 of Lunch Money. As you remember in Chapter 8, Greg and Mr. Z are stretched out on the floor, and Greg is still bleeding from the nose. Chapter 9, Apologies. Greg lay on his back, completely still, even with one nostril plugged. He picked up an oily scent left over from last night's dust mopping. He watched the second hand on the big wall clock and listened to Mr. Z's deep breaths. His math teacher was also stretched out on the floor, about 10 feet away. And Greg thought, now I am completely sunk. This guy is going to ruin me. And then another deeper voice said, yeah, and I deserve it. And Greg knew that second voice was telling the truth. He said, Mr. Z, in a voice so weak he could hardly hear Mr. Z's voice, yes, I'm sorry about the blood stuff. After I saw you, it made you sick. Mora's right. It was mean. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry. Mr. Z was quiet, and then he said, I know. It's irrational, my reaction to that. It's only liquid, and only a word. But seeing it and hearing that word, and make me think about it, it gets me every time. Greg thought a moment. He said, with me it's snakes. And laying there on the floor, Greg shivered. I don't even like pictures of them. Mr. Z said, ah, yes, pictures. When I was in junior high, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I went to the public library and I found a medical textbook. It had pictures. It was the end of my medical career. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Irrational. Anyway, apology accepted. After a moment, Mr. Z said, what about the other matter? Losing your temper over the little books. Any apologies for that? Greg didn't say anything. Mr. Z said, earlier when I told you I was delayed in the office, I was looking through your student file. And Mora's. You two have quite a history of conflict. I thought I was going to be the big problem solver. I thought getting you to apologize would be a help for both of you. Greg turned his head to look at Mr. Z, moving a little so his legs on the desk didn't block the view. The teacher had his eyes shut and his face still looking pale. But you don't understand, Greg said, about my comic book. I mean, I worked all summer. It's like my whole business I'm trying to start. And it makes tons of money. And at the start of math class, I was thinking Mora would mess it all up. What, you didn't think that anymore? Asked Mr. Z. Not really, Greg said. I got a better look at her mini book. She's drawing all her pictures by hand and making her book one at a time. And you're not? No, said Greg. I make one original and then print the rest using a copier. Oh, said Mr. Z. Mass production. Economy of scale, increased profits, and market dominance, right? Greg only stood about half of that. But he said, right, I feel I can make 40 or 50 copies in an hour, and the materials cost around 2 cents a copy. Then I sell each of them for a quarter, and I've got about 20 more comics all planned out. Mr. Z opened his eyes and turned his head to look at Greg. See? You see that? Talking was good. Helped me understand. So why didn't you just talk to Mora? Greg shrugged. Because she's so annoying. Mr. Z's eyes drifted to the blood on Greg's shirt and quickly turned his eyes to the ceiling. He said, I've got a theory about why you two keep fighting. You're both very much alike. And you are each too stubborn to make the step toward being friends. Greg wasn't sure what to say to that. And while he was thinking, Mora came back to the room with the principal right behind her. Mrs. Davenport said, my goodness, looks like an emergency room in here. A bleeder and a fainter come face to face. What are the odds of that? If you can patch up the math teacher, he can run the numbers and figure that out. She chuckled. Miss Emmett's gone. So, I'm your nurse, like it or not. She went to Greg first and handed him a cold pack. Maura tells me that you already know what to do with this. Greg nodded and pressed the blue plastic bag up against his nose. The principal gave a towel and a cold pack to Mr. Z, then pulled a desk closer and lifted his feet to the seat. Get your feet above your head. That's first aid for big, strong, swimming victims. Mrs. Davenport chuckled again. Mr. Z did not. The principal said, Greg, I've already called your mother and she'll meet you at home. Maura's mother is coming in about 5 minutes and she's driving you both. Then she turned to Maura and said, would you go to the girls' room across the hall for me? Wet paper towels. We got to get Greg cleaned up so that Mr. Xantopoulos can get up off the floor. Oh, we could just wait a little bit. And it gets dark and all the blood becomes invisible. She chuckled and then said, sorry about the jokes. I'm just relieved that it isn't more serious. Then turned back to Mr. Z. She said, and I know all the other teachers also relieved when I tell them about tomorrow. More chuckles. Greg had never heard Mrs. Davenport make a joke before. He didn't even know such a thing was possible. And lying on the floor, Greg thought, Mr. Z's gonna get teased by the teachers tomorrow because of the blood makes him faint. Because the blood makes him faint. And I'm gonna get teased by kids because I got a black eye from a girl. Mrs. Davenport used a wet paper towel to clean up Greg's face. And then the desk and the floor. It was a big mess. Before she was done, Maura had to go back for more supplies. All right, Greg. Up you get, slowly, and I will keep your head steady. Mrs. Davenport helped Greg to his feet and then to the desk. Stay put while Maura waits for her mother out front. I've got to get back to the office. Mrs. Xantopoulos, will you be all right for another few minutes, or should I call for an ambulance? Greg could hear her chuckling as she was walking away. He looked down at Mr. Z and said, does she always joke around like this with teachers? 'Cause she's not like that with kids. Mr. Z smiled weakly. It didn't seem proper to talk about Mrs. Davenport with a student, so he said, most teachers have a sense of humor, and that includes principals. Greg stared down at the blue and white soccer shirt, now streaked with blood. Greg thought red, white, and blue. Very patriotic. He moved the desk to Mr. Z, so Mr. Z wouldn't be able to see his front. And then he thought of a question. So, Mr. Z, do you wish sometimes that you could have been a doctor, like you said? Or maybe some other job like that? I mean, instead of just being a teacher? Because if you'd been a doctor, you'd probably be really rich by now. Doctors make so much money, you know? Ed McMahon, his dad's a doctor, and they're super rich. Dr. Z did not want to discuss his personal life. He just laughed a little and said, my older brother's a doctor. He's not rich. Really? Greg was surprised. How come? Because he lives in part of Idaho where they need a good doctor, but there isn't a lot of money for pay for one. Greg said, so how come your brother doesn't move? So how come your brother doesn't move to Chicago or Florida or someplace like that? Mr. Z shrugged. We haven't talked about it much, but I know he likes where he lives and he likes his work there. He's not rich, but he certainly has enough, and for him, enough is enough. Greg said, well, I guess that's okay for some people, but I want to be really, really rich. I'm going to make millions and millions. Said Mr. Z. And what's all that money going to be used for? He asked. Money? Greg looked at Mr. Z as if he was an alien. What's all the money for? To buy stuff, to go places, to get whatever I want, and do anything I want. That's what the money's for, Mr. Z said. So if you had all the money you wanted, what would you do? Greg shrugged. Anything I wanted to. I could do anything. Mr. Z nodded. Right. But give me an example. Okay, said Greg. Like the house we live in now with my parents. It's not very big. 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, a basement, a playroom, a family room. Just a regular house. So if I had enough money, I'd buy a house with something like 10 bedrooms and 15 bathrooms and 2 swimming pools and a huge entertainment center with the home theater and surround sound with bass boosters and a pool table and air hockey stuff. And air hockey too. Stuff like that. Mr. Z raised his eyebrows. Interesting. It was the way that Mr. Z said interesting. Something in his tone of voice and timing. Greg felt a hint of disapproval from the math teacher, and that annoyed him. Greg said, "So you're saying that teachers get paid enough and that you don't want more money, right? You're saying that you don't want a bigger house with fun stuff all over the place and more bedrooms and more bathrooms? Is that what you're saying?" Mr. Z smiled. "I'm not saying anything, but I will tell you something that I call the Xenopolis toilet theory. I will tell you something that I call the Xenopolis toilet theory. Most people can only use one bathroom at a time." After they both laughed a little, the room was quiet for a minute or so. Then Mr. Z said, "What was I saying earlier? How you should be flattered that Mora tried to copy you? I wasn't kidding. Ever hear of old saying imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? I think that Mora thinks that you are interesting." Greg made a face. "No way. You know how teachers can tell which boys and 6th grade girls like." Greg shook his head. I wished Mr. Z would stop talking. He wanted to put his hands over his ears and sing Yankee Doodle. There were things that he did not want to know. Mr. Z went on. "Girls like boys that are always mad at. Shoving or turning their heads away from them, sticking their tongues out, never fails." From down the hall, Mrs. Davenport called, "Greg, Miss Shaw's here. Need any help?" Greg called back, "No, I'm okay." He jumped up. He wanted to leave before Mr. V found something else embarrassing to say. Holding the tissues on the cold pack with one hand, Greg got his things together. "Mr. Z, could you leave me a copy of your comic book? I'd like to take a better look at it." Greg said, "Sure. It's still there on the desk with Mora's. You can have it. Free." He hurried to the doorway, but then paused and turned back. "Listen, Mr. Z, I'm really sorry about making a mess in your room both times." And Mr. Z said, second apology also accepted. "That's 2 for me. 1 more apology for Mora, and you'll be all caught up." Greg didn't smile. In his mind, he said, "Don't count on it." Out loud, he said, "Well, we'll see tomorrow." "Yes, Mr. Z, and if I'm still on the floor when you come to class in 22 hours, then Mrs. Davenport should call an ambulance." As Greg headed to the front doors, it was Mr. Z who was chuckling.